We're going to unravel the layers of faith woven throughout history. Do you know people ruling themselves is very rare when you look at world history? In fact, what happened in America was relatively unique. And let's look back in history. And that's what we do in the book, Change to Chains. We're going to talk about that today.
Today's question of the day, which will be answered at the end of the program, is which U.S. presidents referred to Christianity in their addresses upon assuming office?
Do you know, out of the 6,000 years of world history, there were less than a couple dozen examples of alternatives to monarchy? Monarchy was the normal way the world was run. Think about it. If you drop a bunch of people in the woods, you wind up with an Indian chief. If you drop a bunch of people in an inner city, you wind up with a gang leader. That power ends up concentrating into the hands of one person, who's the monarch, the king. And America did something really different. We took the power of a king and we separated it into three branches, and we made the people the king, and the people got to make the decisions. How rare is it in history for people to rule themselves? It's extremely rare. Most of world history, the default setting is monarchy. So like your computer, the way it's default setting when it comes from the factory is a certain way. Well, the default setting for human beings is monarchy. One person ends up being in charge. And sometimes we call that one person a king, a sultan, a pharaoh, a kaiser, a czar, an Alexander the Great, or an Attila the Hun. But we had something unique. Well, there were only about 24 examples of alternatives to monarchy in all the previous world history prior to the United States. And one of them was the book of Judges in the Old Testament, where the children of Israel did not have a king for about 200 years, and they got to make their own decisions. And God could touch anybody and raise them up to be a deliverer or a ruler of the Israelites. But after 200 years, the Israelites said, we don't like this. We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. And the Lord said through prophet Samuel, you're not going to like it, but here's Saul. But we look at another instance was the Greeks. Now, monarchs' state power was actually defended by the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato witnessed the chaotic democracy that existed in Athens for about maybe 300 years. Plato described the ideal society as a body with the abdomen being the working class with souls of iron and bronze, the chest and arms being the military class with souls of silver, and the head being philosopher kings with souls of gold. In his Republic, 380 BC, Plato recounted a conversation with Socrates on how a crisis of a state leads to power in the hands of one. Plato outlined how government devolves in stages. The first stage for a government, according to Plato, was aristocracy. This was rule by the best, the most capable, the successful property owners and experienced entrepreneurs. Think about it. They know how to run a farm, they know how to run a business, and they sort of have some sense on how to run a country or a government or a city. And so these were people that Plato called the best, or the aristocracy. Well, they, according to Plato's steps, were followed by a timocracy. These were vain people who coveted honor, public adulation, and fame. They were attracted and drawn to leadership, and they were tempted, once in power, to use their positions for their own benefit. You sort of see that would be the natural progression of things. So you got some people that know how to rule, and they're just doing a good job, and then they have kids, and those kids are like, hey, I want to line my pockets, and now that I'm in power, I want to benefit myself over here and over there. Well, that gives birth, according to Plato, to the third stage called an oligarchy. An oligarchy means rule by a few. Monarchy means rule by one, and oligarchy means rule by a few. And these few become a clique, who are the leadership because of hereditary family ties, royalty, or military leaders. These are people, and we can look at what's happening in America. 90% of congressmen and senators get reelected. Why? That's because they get to write the laws, and the laws regarding elections and campaigning, and they write them to benefit them. I mean, it only makes sense. That's sort of human nature. And so the laws are written to make it very difficult for a challenger, a new person, to be elected. The laws, in a sense, help protect a clique, people that are in power, and it's designed to help keep them in power. I ran for Congress several times, and I experienced this, how you could, nobody wanted to offend the person that's in office because they wanted to have access and they wanted to have favors, and they're very skeptical about backing someone else. And so the system benefits those that are in. Well, Plato goes on. Plato says that this clique, so you go from a aristocracy to a timocracy to an oligarchy. An oligarchy is a clique, and these are leaders, but they're not necessarily gifted at ruling. And a rich and poor divide develops. So here you have these people in, and they're voting themselves favors. And we saw lots of stories of Nancy Pelosi's jet, where she got to fly and spend, you know, $70,000 every time she went home or to her district and so forth. You know, the people that were in got the positions of benefit, and they would continue to vote themselves. And so they became richer, and then the common people ended up struggling. And so in Athens, the common people became poorer. And this started a divide, a rich and poor divide. And then the poor got to the place where they could only beg or steal from the rich, or just become servants to the rich. And so this struggle caused some animosity, to where the rich would defend their assets, and they're all concerned about how to keep somebody from robbing from them. And then the poor are wanting to take that. And this turns into the fourth step that Plato described, a democracy. And he said that democracy is the people end up finally taking control. They take the control away from the aristocracy and the timocracy and the oligarchy. But these people are not experienced in ruling. I mean, they've been ruled their whole lives, but they haven't been raised up in how do you run things. You know, how do you run businesses? How do you run governments? And so what happens is they yield to the lowest part of their human nature, greed. And they say, hey, now that we're in power, let's raid the treasury, let's vote ourselves. And they end up taking the money from the rich and putting it into their own pockets. And then the rich end up leaving or abandoning and not wanting to, you know, create more jobs and so forth. And this socioeconomic divide widens, and the middle class disappears. Tensions arise, resulting in inexperienced leaders from the democracy being put in office, and end up where they grant all kinds of rights. Yes, they do. They grant all kinds of rights and freedoms in the democracy, but the commoners, again, unaccustomed to leadership, become drunk with power. They yield to selfishness, vote money out of the treasury, and confusion reigns. Now, this is Plato. This is not me making this up. You could get any book and read about this Greek philosopher Plato that lived 380 B.C., and he is studying human nature. He says, okay, you go from aristocracy to timocracy to oligarchy, then you go to a democracy, but the democracy, the people ruling without virtue, they become selfish, and then chaos reigns. And out of the chaos, a tyrant arises. How does it happen? Well, a tyranny. It's a rule by one, the tyrant. Commoners, having democratic freedoms without moral restraints, results in chaos. And as according to Plato, society divided into these three categories: the dominating class of the elites, and then the poor commoners. The conflict between the different classes causes the poor commoners to seek out someone who will protect their interests. They find a visually appealing demagogue and invest in him all their power and all their hopes that he will be their champion against the other classes. This demagogue is a human being, and he ends up becoming corrupted by power, turns into the tyrant with no checks on his arbitrary power, and he winds up in absolute control over everything. And the tyrant surrounds himself with a small entourage of supporters for protection. And this was Plato. This is what this philosopher in Greece said that civilizations would go through, where you have an aristocracy, a timocracy, an oligarchy, and then a democracy. Democracy without virtue ends in chaos, and a tyrant, a tyranny takes over. Will and Ariel Durant were historians, and the Durants wrote in their book, The Lessons of History, Plato's reduction of political evolution is a sequence from aristocracy to democracy to dictatorship. When poor, uneducated, and undisciplined citizens, called the proletariat, get the right to vote in a democracy, the chaos that will result gradually gives way to the rise of a communist dictator. As French socialist Jean Jaurès, who lived 1859 to 1914, explained, the proletariat will come to power under the universal right to vote. Our society will gradually develop toward communism. George Washington explained that when citizens yield to undisciplined and immoral behavior, which he called licentiousness, a dictator will arise exercising arbitrary power. Now, what is arbitrary power? Arbitrary means absolute, and it's total control, and arbitrary means there's no blueprint, there's no standard that they can do anything they want. Arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused by licentiousness. Now, you can sort of see where I'm going with this, is that in America, we went from an aristocracy to a timocracy to an oligarchy to a democracy. Our experiment with democracy lasted longer than previous experiments. Why? Because the people had virtue. The people had Judeo-Christian morals. They were taught this Christian idea, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. You see, the Greeks didn't have that. They just had, hey, we're human beings, we got these Greek gods, and yeah, I can take something that'll benefit me, sure, I'm going to take it. And they would just yield to this selfish aspect of fallen human nature. But the democracy lasted in America longer than all previous attempts because the people had virtue. Now, Plato, in his mind, democracy was chaos and a tyrant would arise. Plato's hope was that someday a philosopher tyrant, a philosopher king would come to power and he would rule unselfishly. He'd just naturally be a nice guy, and he'd be more enlightened and intelligent than the poor, uneducated masses. He would have an agenda that was just really, really good. Now, the problem is every tyrant claims that they are that extra special person, and they end up getting in control, and they don't want to get out of control, so they kill anybody that challenges them. Plato wrote in The Republic, he said, there will be no end to the troubles of a state till philosophers become kings. In his The Laws, Plato proposed the idea that in his imaginary society, and I want to pause here, Plato's perfect society has never taken place in all of world history. This is this 4th century BC philosopher just talking out loud. He's just sharing his ideas. Never has it actually been put into practice successfully. So the people today that are striving toward this communist secular utopia using Plato as their blueprint, they're using somebody as a guide that has never been successful. So that's important for us to understand. So when Plato has his imaginary society, Plato says that the private and individual is banished from life, and all private property and worldly possessions, including wives and children, would belong to the state. This is this Plato guy. Plato inspired totalitarian monarchs and communist dictators and theorists such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and Mao Zedong, and these wrote in their Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, in 1848, they said the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolish private property. Now let's pause there. Here is the founders of communism saying that all this communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolish private property. And so you look at What's happened in America? You know, we have in our Declaration the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You read the editions before that, and it was life, liberty, and property. Well, why did they change it from property to pursuit of happiness? Well, they figured that you could not pursue happiness without property. And so the idea of property was inside of this pursuit of happiness, and the pursuit of happiness basically said that you could use your property, you could expand on it. Well, Roger Baldwin was the founder of the ACLU. He wrote in the Harvard Reunion book in 1935, "I seek social ownership of property, the abolition of the property class, sole control of those that produce wealth. Communism is the goal." In the book Change to Chains is the survey of world power, and it highlights how America is really unique in that we allowed individuals to own property and individuals to pursue their dreams. You know, the ACLU is in the news a lot, but the founder of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, that he actually leaned toward communism. He wrote in his Harvard Reunion book, 1935, "I seek social ownership of property." That means that the state's going to own the property. Roger Baldwin goes on to say that he seeks the abolition of the propertied class. That means that he wants to get rid of people that own property, and he concludes by saying he wants to have the sole control over those who produce wealth. Communism is the goal. So whenever you see the ACLU, the founder of it said communism is the goal. Well, communist ownership of property is completely opposite from the wishes of America's founders. As Noah Webster wrote in the preface of his American Dictionary of the English Language, 1841. Noah Webster wrote, "The liberty of the press, trial by jury, habeas corpus, even the Magna Carta itself, although justly deemed the Palladia of freedom, are inferior considerations when compared with a general distribution of real property among every class of people." Let me pause there. This is Noah Webster, and he wrote Webster's Dictionary. He says all these other rights are great, but he says really they're no good unless you have the right to own property. And if you have property, then you can have a place that you can save your hard work, and then you can use that money to improve your status in life and you know, get an education and buy more tools, and then you can advance all the other freedoms and take advantage of them. Noah Webster continues. He says the power of entailing estates or limiting property is more dangerous to liberty and Republican government than are all the constitutions that can be written on a paper, or even than a standing army. So he says that it's more dangerous to try to take away, have policies that can take away people's private property than having a standing army. Noah Webster concludes, "Let the people have property and they will have power, a power that will forever be exerted to prevent a restriction of the press and the abolition of trial by jury or the abridgment of any other privilege. The production of genius and the imagination are, if possible, more really and exclusively property than houses and lands, and are equally entitled to legal security." So, this is one of the aspects. Do you know the first recorded instance of individuals owning agricultural land? What do you think it is? It was the Israelites. In the law where it says, don't move the ancient landmarks. Remember that? In the Moses with all the law, and you read this, that, this, it says, don't move the ancient landmarks. You know, they build a pile of rocks to show this is where my property ends and yours begins. And people would say, hey, nobody's around, let me move this pile of rocks and get more property. And, you know, when you look at the Akkadian, the Assyrian, the Egyptian, the Elamites, all these other ancient civilizations, the king owned the property. They've uncovered caches, large areas where there would be a storehouse in Sumeria, where the king owned all the land and would have these cuneiform, these clay little blocks with little stick marks in it, and they can decipher them and say, okay, This is the king saying this is what's going to be grown. This is how much is going to be grown and who's going to grow it. And there's the king owning, the state owning all of the land. And so the Jews, the Bible, is the first instance. So not only is the Bible, the Israelites, one of the first examples of a nation ruling themselves without a king, the Israelites were also one of the first examples of people having private agricultural property. Communism, apart from its rhetoric, is just a method of regime change back to a despotic monarchy, a communist dictator. So it's sort of a play on words. You see, after America came into existence, and we had a republic, a democratic republic, so the people vote in the representatives. So democracy means the people rule, but republic means representative rule. So you're busy supporting your family, so you hire a representative to look out for your interests. The democracy, you have to be up on every issue and spend all your time studying the issues because everybody votes on everything. You know what's interesting, a little chapter of Greece that gets overlooked, is that how in Athens could everybody keep up on everything? They had lots of slavery. Like 40% of Athens were slaves. Now, it wasn't Africans that they had slaves. It was other peoples that they had captured from the area around there. But they had slavery to make democracy work. Why? Because everybody had to learn about every issue. Matter of fact, if somebody did not get involved in learning about every issue, the Greeks had a word for that person. It was idiotus, or where we get the word idiot. So somebody that didn't keep up with all the political issues in Athens was called an idiot. And so the people couldn't spend their time working their farms or their businesses because they had to keep up on these issues, and that's why they had the slaves take care of it. But a republic is where you take care of your farm and your business, and you hire a representative to look out for your interests, and that's the same rep, R-E-P, for representative is the same rep, R-E-P, for republic. Res publica, it means in the place of. And so we in America have a republic. We democratically elect, we vote for our representatives, but we spend the time raising our family. And those representatives are supposed to look out for our interests. And so here we have this republic. But after America came into being and after America became very prosperous, and it sort of put a peer pressure on other nations that monarchy was not the right way to go. And so these monarchs would gradually give more freedoms to their people, and one of the few exceptions was Britain, where they were able to give enough power to the parliament that the people allowed the monarchy to continue more or less like a figurehead. You know, other countries like Russia, where they didn't give power to a parliament, the people finally just got upset and got rid of the king. And so, but other than that, America put this peer pressure on the other nations where they decided that they wanted to have the people rule. And so now if you were somebody that wanted to be a dictator, wanted to be a monarch, you couldn't use the word monarch. You couldn't call it an empire, so you changed it. And you simply called it communism. You say, the people own everything. But do the people really own everything? Somebody in the communist government decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house. Somebody decides who's going to work on the farm and who's going to, you know, be in the nice cushy job, you know. And then the head of that party is the communist dictator. So communism is really dictatorship. You have the Mao Zedong, Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro. You have the one person that controls it. It's not communism, it's a dictatorship. And if you're a part of his party, you're a part of the royalty, and you get favorable treatment. And if you're not part of that party, you're a peon, you're a subject. And so communism is just a word for regime change back to the old-fashioned monarchy. And I hope that makes sense. Well, as a citizen allows the state to own their property and redistribute their wealth, they lose the incentive to create. They lose the incentive to work hard, as it will not be to their individual best interests. We're going to be back in just a minute and look some more at this difference between concentrated power and separated power and private property.
Now, here's the answer to the question of the day. Which U.S. presidents mentioned Christianity by name in their addresses upon assuming office? Second President John Adams, 1797. Quote, respect for Christianity among the best recommendations for the public service, unquote. Ninth President William Henry Harrison, 1841. Quote, a profound reverence for the Christian religion, unquote. 10th President John Tyler, 1841. Quote, when a Christian people feel themselves to be overtaken by a great public calamity, unquote. 15th President James Buchanan, 1857. Quote, Christian benevolence toward our fellow men, unquote. 16th President Abraham Lincoln, 1861. Quote, intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on Him who has never yet forsaken this favored land, unquote. 17th President Andrew Johnson, 1865. Quote, the day aforesaid is sacred to large numbers of Christians as one of rejoicing for the ascension of the Savior, unquote. And 26th President Theodore Roosevelt, 1901. Quote, Christian fortitude, unquote.
America's form of government unleashed human potential. You see, when the king and the state owns the property and owns everybody's lives, you lose your incentive to work. I mean, why work harder when you're going to get the same? And so as they own it, this results in falling production and increased poverty and more dependence on the state. As control concentrates to the state, Communist Party organizers effectively become the new aristocracy. The head of the party acts as the new monarchs. Will and Ariel Durant, historians, wrote in their Lessons of History, violent revolutions do not so much as redistribute wealth as destroy it. There may be a redivision of land, but the natural inequality of men soon recreates an inequality of possessions and privileges and raises to power a new minority with essentially the same instincts as in the old. So you get rid of one czar, Nicholas Alexander there in Russia, and then you get a Stalin. Well, they're both totalitarian leaders of the state. Doesn't matter if you call it a monarchy or a communism. It's one person that is the total control person. Well, when the state controls everything and you're not going to benefit from your hard work, guess what? You're not going to work hard. And in America, where you got to have your own property and you could work hard, get an education, and you benefited from this, this unleashed this self-interest to work harder, and that's when all these inventions, from automobiles to airplanes to telephones, get invented, and it caused America to become the most prosperous nation in the 6,000 years of world history. Well, this is all in the book, Change to Chains, The 6,000-Year Quest for Control, The Rise of the Republic. Fascinating book. Thank you.
This has been a TCT Network exclusive production. If you would like to see more exclusive special programs, send your support to TCT, P.O. Box 1010, Marion, Illinois, 62959.